The giant had never once in his life been made to feel small, and the man he had just lifted off the floor by the front of his shirt weighed less than half of what he did. That was the arithmetic every one of the 20,000 people in the building did in the same instant. It was the wrong arithmetic, and the only person who seemed to know that was the small man, hanging a few inches off the ground with his shoes swinging free and his breathing completely unchanged. It was a martial arts exhibition in the early 1970s, the kind of event that filled an arena for one night and was never meant to settle anything. Masters had been brought in from a dozen disciplines to demonstrate, not to compete. There were no sanctioned matches, no purse, nothing at stake but reputation, which is another way of saying everything was at stake and no one wanted to admit it. Along the front of the floor sat men whose faces the crowd knew from magazines and movie posters. Among them a heavyweight boxing champion in an open collar, relaxed and watchful, and a karate champion in a dark gi who had been asked to help judge the demonstrations and had spent the whole evening saying very little. The giant was the closing attraction. He was billed under a name that made him sound like a myth, and in person he was somehow larger than the billing. He stood a shade under 7 feet and carried close to 300 pounds more than most of the men in the building, and when he walked out onto the floor, the sound the crowd made was not applause exactly. It was the noise people make when something arrives that their eyes are not quite prepared to measure. He had come up through the wrestling circuits of Europe and Japan, and there was a thing people said about him that they said about no one else, that he had never tested the full extent of his own strength, because he was afraid of what it would do to another man. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, one of the gentlest men alive. None of that was visible tonight. Tonight he had decided to be entertaining, and his idea of entertaining was to find the smallest serious man in the building and make a point. If you want to understand why the smallest man in the building was the most dangerous, stay with this, because he had already spent the whole evening watching the giant, and he had seen something the crowd had not. The small man had demonstrated earlier, quietly, without spectacle. He had done a few things with his hands that were too fast for most of the room to follow, and he had said, in the flat way of a man stating a fact rather than selling one, that speed was not the point, and power was not the point, that the point was understanding where a man's strength lived so that you never had to meet it. The crowd had liked it without quite believing it. The giant, watching from the wings, had liked it least of all because it sounded to him like a small man's excuse for being small. So when the demonstrations were winding down, the giant walked to the center of the floor, took a microphone that looked like a toothpick in his hand, and said that he had heard a great deal tonight about understanding and technique and the mind, and that he wanted to try an experiment. He looked around the floor, and his eyes landed on the small man in the white shirt, and he beckoned him out with 2 fingers the way a man calls a child. There was laughter. The small man rose from his seat and walked out, unhurried, and stood in front of the giant, and the difference between them was so absurd that the laughter got louder. The top of the small man's head reached somewhere around the giant's chest. The giant smiled down at him and said, loud enough for the microphone to carry it to the back rows, that he did not mean any insult, but that all the philosophy in the world did not change one simple thing. He reached out and set one enormous hand flat against the small man's chest, almost gently, and said that a real fight was not a conversation. And then, without warning and without much effort, he closed his hand around the front of the small man's shirt and lifted. The small man came off the floor, not far, a few inches, but enough that the front row saw daylight beneath his shoes, and enough that the entire building understood what it was seeing. The strongest man any of them had ever laid eyes on, holding a man half his size off the ground by a fistful of cotton in front of 20,000 people as easily as a man lifts a coat off a hook. And here is the part worth staying for, because it was not what the small man did. It was what he did not do. He did not grab the giant's wrist. He did not kick or twist or scramble for the floor. He did not brace his body the way a hanging man's body wants to brace. He simply hung there, his arms loose at his sides, and looked into the giant's face from a few inches away with an expression that had no fear in it, and no anger in it, and worst of all for the giant, no urgency in it. He looked like a man waiting for an elevator, and his breathing, which the boxing champion in the front row was close enough to watch, did not change at all. For about 5 seconds, nobody in the building made a sound. The giant had lifted many men, and every one of them had done something. Struggled, laughed nervously, gone stiff, performed some small human acknowledgement of the fact that they were off the ground and helpless. This one did nothing. And in the silence the giant felt, for the first time in a very long time, a flicker of something he did not have a name for, because holding a man in the air is only satisfying if the man understands he is being held, and this man was looking at him as though the two of them were simply standing in a room together, and one of them happened to be higher up. Down in the front row, the boxing champion stood up. He did not shout. He did not step onto the floor. He just rose to his feet, the way a man rises when he can feel that the thing in front of him has stopped being a joke, and he wanted a clearer view of whatever was about to happen. Several people would remember that later, that one of the most famous men in the world had watched thousands of fights, and this was the one that got him out of his seat. The small man spoke. His voice was quiet, and the room was so silent that it carried anyway. He said, "You have my shirt." He said it the way a man points out a small, correctable error. Then he said, "You do not have me." And the giant, who did not fully understand the sentence, tightened his grip to prove it wrong, and that was the moment the small man moved. He did not do anything large. That was what the people close enough to see it could never quite explain afterward. His right hand came up, and his fingers found a specific place on the inside of the giant's gripping wrist, and his body turned no more than a few degrees, and he exhaled once, short and sharp. The giant's enormous hand opened. Not because the giant chose to open it. The people in the front row watched his face, and his face was surprised, but because something the small man had done to that one spot on the wrist had traveled up through the arm and told the hand, at a level below thought, that holding on was no longer possible. The small man's shoes touched the floor. He had not been dropped. He had simply, quietly arranged to be released. The giant stared at his own open hand as if it had betrayed him. Then he did what large, strong men do when a thing they have always relied on fails them in public. He reached for the small man again, both hands this time, a real grab, fast for a man his size and backed by all the weight in the world. The small man was not there. He had not stepped back. Stepping back is retreat, and retreat gives ground. He had stepped in, inside the giant's arms, into the one place a man that size cannot easily use his size, close enough that the giant's reach folded around empty air, and from there the small man placed one open palm, flat against the giant's midsection, at the soft place beneath the ribs, where all the strength in the world provides no protection, and he did not strike it. He simply rested his hand there and let the giant feel where it was, and looked up at him. The giant went still. He was a professional. He had been in front of enough crowds and inside enough real moments to know the difference between a man who was bluffing and a man who was showing him mercy. And he knew, with the hand resting against the one part of him that could not be trained to resist, exactly which one this was. If that palm had been a strike, this would already be over, and both of them knew it, and the 20,000 people who could not see the hand only knew that the giant, who had been laughing a minute ago, was now standing perfectly still and looking down at a man half his size, as though the floor had shifted under him. The small man took his hand away. He stepped back out of the giant's space, and he did the thing that turned the night from a humiliation into something the giant would carry with him for the rest of his life. He reached up. He had to reach up a long way, and he straightened the front of his own shirt where the giant's grip had twisted it, unhurried, and then he looked at the giant and inclined his head, a small bow, the kind of bow you give an opponent you respect, not one you have beaten. He said quietly that the giant was the strongest man he had ever stood in front of, and that it was true, and that it did not matter, and that both of those things could be true at once. He said that strength like the giant's was a gift, and that the only thing that ever wasted it was believing it answered every question. And the giant, who had come out here to make a small man look small, and had instead been shown in front of the largest crowd of his life the exact edge of the one thing he had always trusted, did not get angry. The people who told this story afterward always seemed surprised by that part, but the people who actually knew the giant were not surprised at all, because underneath the size he was a man of unusual gentleness, and gentleness recognizes itself. He looked at the small man for a long moment. Then he began slowly to smile, and it was not a performer's smile. He reached down and offered his hand, the same hand that had lifted the small man off the floor a minute earlier, and this time the small man took it, and it disappeared entirely inside the giant's grip, and the giant shook it with a care that a man only uses when he has just learned the difference between force and control. The boxing champion in the front row sat back down. The karate champion in the dark gi, who had said almost nothing all evening, was watching the two men shake hands with the expression of a man filing something away that he would think about for years, and the crowd, which had come for a spectacle and had been given something quieter and much harder to describe, did not roar. They made the low, uncertain, rolling sound a very large room makes when it has just watched something it does not have a category for and is trying altogether to understand what it saw. The giant lifted the microphone one more time. His voice, which had been booming and theatrical when he called the small man out, came out different now, lower and without any performance left in it. He told the crowd that he had spent his whole life being the biggest man in every room he ever walked into, and that he had believed for most of it that this settled every argument before it started. He looked down at the small man beside him. Then he said that tonight, for the first time, someone had shown him that it settled nothing at all, and that he was grateful because a man could go his whole life without ever learning that and be poorer for it. And then he said with the smallest laugh that he was very glad the small man had chosen to be gentle, because he had felt exactly where that hand was resting, and he understood now what it could have done. The small man left the floor the way he had come onto it, without hurry, without looking back to see whether anyone was applauding. He walked past the front row, and the boxing champion said something to him too low for anyone else to hear, and the small man nodded once and kept walking. He was gone before most of the crowd had finished deciding how they felt. Years later, the people who had been in that building would argue about the details, the way people always do, how far off the floor the small man had really come, whether it was one hand or two that the giant used the second time, exactly what was said at the end. But the ones who had been close enough to the front, close enough to see the small man hang there without fear, and see the giant's hand fall open against its owner's will, always told that part the same way. The strongest man any of them had ever seen had picked up a man half his size to prove that strength was the only thing that mattered. And the small man had let himself be picked up, and had answered without anger and without a single real blow, and had somehow made the strongest man in the building, the one who walked away, changed,